Oh no, mate. I'm going to laugh my way through this. Unbelievable. Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon. I'm the Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders University, and welcome to vlog 131, research that agitates, transforms and challenges. And I have a very, very special guest with me this week. We were always going to do this vlog.
We were.
For 2 years.
Yes.
Andrew Paterson is with me today. Dr Andrew Paterson is with me today. And he's positioned in this very interesting liminal moment that I did want to capture. His PhD is completed, obviously. The examination has occurred and everything's done and been fantastic. He's made all those corrections. It's brilliant. And he is about to graduate. And in this liminal time, I wanted to talk to him about many things, about the PhD itself, but also I wanted to challenge him a little bit today and summon those two words that are so important in Australian academic life, but also internationally. And those two words are impact and engagement. So at this point, where Andrew, I believe that's your thesis, isn't it, Andrew?
It is.
So it's not just like this tome, it is this bound document. But okay, there's a thesis. What happens now? How do we make that research dance and sing and transform and move? And that's really our task of the day. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning, Tara.
It's been quite a ride, mate.
It has.
And we were always going to be here. Actually, Andrew was one of the first people I think I met at Flinders University, one of the first Fridays that I'd arrived in this job. Andrew, this fantastic man, turned up and said hello. So we were always probably going to do this vlog. We should say hello to your grandchildren too, who
Yes.
watch so many of them. Do you want to do a wave?
Hello, Alice and James. How are you?
This is fantastic. So they've been sort of my companion as well, and they've
Yes.
done videos back to me to say hello, for which I'm very grateful. So, Andrew, you're a spectacular human on the planet, and congratulations on the PhD.
Thank you.
But let's now start with, if I can, what drew you to start a PhD in the first place, if you remember, at this juncture?
I think during my long career in the justice system, there were a couple of occasions at least where I thought it was time to do some more postgrad study.
Right.
But there was always some kind of intervention, a bushfire or a change of job or something like that, that prevented that from happening. So when I came here in 2010 as a field ed coordinator in the Masters Social Work program,
Yes.
people started talking to me about that quite early, and that wasn't because they recognised intrinsic scholarship. I think it was rather they thought that my career was interesting and it might translate into some kind of postgraduate effort.
Interesting.
And that appealed to me.
Yeah.
So it moved from there. I had some conversations with Professor Fiona Verity about that.
Fantastic.
And I had some misgivings because I think I had always seen myself more as a practitioner than an academic, but she decided that it would be much better if I accepted the challenge of becoming a scholar.
And a gentleman.
And a gentleman, I hope. She didn't mention that at the time.
Well, I'm surprised, but it is interesting that you talk about that transition from a practitioner to an academic, and you really do describe that as a transition. And a lot of our students probably feel exactly the same way.
Yeah.
Looking back on it now, was it as difficult as you thought it might be?
No, I don't think, because I was interested, and the whole process fulfilled something in me, I think, that had concerned me for some time. Remembering that I was around when the first diagnostic statistics manual was published.
Yeah.
I was practicing then, and that was post-Vietnam. And I was working in a crisis program, and we had what we thought was more than a reasonable amount of contact with Vietnam vets.
Yeah.
And then I became involved with a small group of psychologists who were setting up the Vietnam Veterans Counselling Service, and that led to the establishment of that program. But my concern at that time was that we were calling the young men returning from Vietnam disordered.
Yes.
as part of the post-traumatic stress disorder thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And that seemed odd.
Yes.
And I'd never changed from feeling the oddness of that. I mean, the reactions, the responses, it seemed to me were quite normal in terms of what they must have experienced, especially the conscripts.
And see, this is really powerful, and this demonstrates, you've heard a lot about Andrew already, and we're going to talk about the actual thesis itself in a second, but I would also say, Andrew, what made your thesis so powerful, what made your scholarship so powerful, is that politicised imperative. So it is interesting that, 20 seconds into his first question, he went to the Vietnam War. And I think that's quite powerful and important, because that's about war, militarism, masculinity, and what happens when masculinity gets disordered, and how a culture manages and handles that. Now, that's going to be quite significant going forward, but that politicised nature of you has certainly made you a privilege to supervise, and also might become quite important in terms of the dissemination that we handle in a second.
Yes.
Now, you researched the police.
Yes.
The South Australian Police Force, SAPOL.
Yes.
Why the cops?
Because they were always part of what I did. The very early stages was the crisis care experience, which was an extraordinary undertaking, a cooperative move between the then State Department for Community Welfare and SAPOL.
Right.
And SAPOL's motivation was quite clear. They were spending, this was 1975, they were spending, as far as they were concerned, far too much operational time working with what were then called domestics. And they thought that by partnering up with a mob of social workers, they would reduce that operational time, because we would walk in and solve the problem, so they would never have to attend that dispute again.
Wow. How did that go?
Well, I must say that I applied for the supervisor's job with a great deal of enthusiasm, but after I got it, I was summoned to the CEO's office, that is the Department for Community Welfare CEO's office, who asked me if I was flexible. And I said, I hope so. Why do you ask? And he said, we may have to find you another job, because his level of optimism was almost invisible, I think. So what we had to do was engage with the police culture. We had to become credible, because what happened basically was that police patrols would attend a dispute or a situation of some kind, and then they would make a decision whether they would call us in or not. So they would talk about that. They would then make a radio call back to communications, who would telephone us on a proper line, and we would give an estimated time of arrival, attend.
Right.
There would be a brief conversation, usually outside of the premises, between the patrol and whoever one of us
was
went.
Attending. Yes.
And we went alone. I don't think that would happen now, but anyway. We would have the briefest of briefings. The patrol would then resume their duties, and we would walk into the house. And
alone?
Yeah, alone. And do whatever we could in terms of crisis intervention theory, as it was then.
Yes.
And then make appropriate referrals. The problem with that, though, was that there weren't all that many places to refer domestic violence victims, and particularly perpetrators, to at that time. There were women's shelters, and we formed a very close relationship with them.
Yeah.
And they were largely run by feminists who were deeply concerned about this problem a decade or two.
Deeply committed?
Deeply committed, before society showed very much concern at all.
And once more, and this might be an interesting trope through this vlog as well, troubled masculinity is sitting and bubbling through your career. But you've therefore been watching the police force through much of your career, and indeed engaging with them as an outsider, but as an insider, as both. Yes.
After that, I headed up the victim support program in the state, and of course, police have always been responsive to victims, because they see them at their most vulnerable. They attend after crimes are committed. So SAPOL was just beginning to treat that seriously when victim support happened.
Right.
And I was privileged to work with a group of female police officers, mostly sergeants, who established the victim support programs that SAPOL now have. and also the domestic violence programs and activities that SAPOL encourage and support.
Yeah.
And I think there was a time in South Australia where the state government lost its focus on domestic violence because it became primarily focused on child protection, as though there was no
link.
Yes. So that was that. Then the prison experience, the same thing. I mean, if you're running a prison in Mary Bridge, you become very good friends with the local police because occasionally you need them.
You need them.
Yeah.
At relatively short notice.
Yes. And it was fortunate that they weren't far away
on occasion.
Yeah. And I had a close working relationship with them. And the other thing that we often did was we charged prisoners for offences committed within the prison, and the police, CIB, usually were involved in that. After that, the consultancy that I set up was around crime prevention, because I thought that preventing crime was quite a good idea at this stage.
Yes.
And so I worked with police intelligence police at that stage, because that was when intelligence-led policing, as it's called, was starting to develop.
Fascinating.
So there were always police.
And so therefore, let's try and update this story now so you can see the long term, the decades of this insider-outsider work with the police force, as the police force was also changing its feminisation, its understanding of victimhood and so forth,
Yes.
and all the different modalities through which we understand criminal and social justice. So therefore, what was the goal of the PhD? With your work with police, which you decided to do, what was the point? What was the goal of the research, Andrew?
I think the goal of the research was to approach the whole trauma thing from a different perspective. What interested me, I think, right through my career was the conversations I had with police about the impact of what they did on them.
Yeah.
And that wasn't talked about within the organisation. It was very much the masculine thing. But when we went away together at conferences, when I was at conferences on domestic violence or whatever with police officers, we'd have a few beers at the close of the day, and the conversation would turn to that kind of thing. Usually the conversation was begun by the officers themselves, because they wanted to talk to someone who they saw as a helping professional in a context that they understood would be confidential, and it was. But I was interested in how they coped, because back then, and to a certain extent now, there was no recognition that they even needed to. It was assumed. So my interest in the PhD was to look at policing from the perspective of resilience, and that comes, I think, from the basis of social work, which is strengths, to look for positives rather than just go in looking for negatives and disadvantage and that kind of thing, dysfunction. So it was logical that I should use a qualitative approach to interview police, long interviews, about how they basically coped, and that's what transpired.
That's remarkable. And therefore, so you interviewed, where were we at, 50 coppers?
50, yep.
50 coppers.
Yep.
Now, that in and of itself, for my international colleagues out there, you know how rare this data set is. But Andrew, when did you realise that what you had was remarkable research here? When did you go, oh wow, I've got something?
I think it happened in two stages. The first was the response. I was involved in placing social work students in police settings at that stage, which was radical. And there were a couple of students placed in South Coast, to the south of the city, where our daughter works as a police officer in family violence. That's the other connection.
Indeed.
And I went down there at the invitation of a CIB chief inspector to talk to a sergeant's training day about my research. And I thought, this could be interesting for me, but maybe not so much for them. But
for them, yeah.
I walked in and talked about the whole process of engaging in a PhD and what I intended to do. And it was the session right before lunch. There were about 50 sergeants in the room, I think, and they're not, generally speaking, all that huggy. And
I was going to say, they're not known to be oversharers, are they?
No, fair enough. But they seemed during the presentation to be quite interested. And after I finished, they thanked me politely, and lunch was being prepared at the back of the room, and suddenly I was surrounded by police sergeants holding out business cards saying, I want to be in this, I want to be involved in this.
Oh my God.
Talk to me. So
Yeah.
that was encouraging. The second phase of the same experience, I think, was the first and second interviews, where I reckon by about 15 minutes into the interviews, when the coppers were in full song, I realised that this was something they didn't talk about, they hadn't talked about. And many of them said to me at the end of the conversation two things. First is, I've never had a conversation like this before. And the second was, it's been therapeutic in some way.
Wow. Wow.
So I wasn't trying to be a
No.
therapist. I was pretty clear that that wasn't my role. But that's what happened. And as the thing gathered momentum, people, our coppers wanting to be interviewed, just self-referred. For example, I interviewed a 15-year veteran of the STAR group, the Special Task and Rescue Group, which is the pointy end of policing.
Yep.
And I interviewed him, I remember, in his home, and his wife kind of hovered while we were talking at the kitchen table, and a couple of times sat down and made a contribution. But at the end of that, he sent me an email and said, that was fantastic, that was really important. I'd like to talk to a couple of my mates, my colleagues, and within 24 hours, 3 or 4 of his colleagues in STAR Group had made contact with me, and I interviewed them as well. And that's the way it evolved.
I mean, we talk about snowball, but I mean, that is an incredible snowball. And the data set you've configured was so incredibly rare, I mean, and deep and complex and disturbing and fascinating. I mean, I've never seen a data set like it. So, you know, and then of course your interpretation and your analysis and your experience and expertise was simply stellar. I'm going to get you to help us with something else if we can. So you have just finished, and when you finish, obviously Steve and I were Andrew's supervisors, and when you finished and you submitted, he was exhausted, as all PhD students are when they submitted, I gave you about 4 days off by memory.
You did.
And I think by the following, I have weekly meetings with Andrew, and I think we had the regular meeting as normal.
Yeah, we did.
The following Thursday. Gee, I'm hard.
Tough.
But tell us about that dissemination period, because I think a lot of students sort of hang about while the thesis is under examination, like what am I doing? And I really didn't let you do that, but also you didn't let yourself do that. So tell us about that examination period and the dissemination strategies from it, sir.
Well, the strategies evolved, I think, from the structure of the thesis itself, and that was the first radical change that you and Steve suggested, quite heavily, I suggest, but anyway, where I changed the thing from the classic PhD structure with this, as you said, I think quite recently in a blog, this huge, boring literature review chapter.
I'm not classy, am I, Andrew? I'm not classy.
I think you are, but that's for another time.
But it was pretty boring, yeah, it was. But yours wasn't boring. The literature review as a chapter is a boring thing.
Yeah. Anyway, so what we did was we structured all of that into the chapters. The chapters were then thematic, and that meant that at the end of the thesis, when it was finally edited and sent away, I had all these chapters which were complete stories in themselves. So the chapter on the feminisation of policing had the literature, it had the interviews, it had the discussion.
The analysis, the edgy argument.
All that stuff, yeah. And so when you started suggesting that I submit for journal articles, the first one I sent off, I got a response in about 10 minutes saying this is really interesting. Off we go. So that's kept on happening. And basically all I've had to do is get rid of some of the footnotes which refer to other chapters, which would be unwise, I would suggest, if they're not there. And then basically add a bibliography at the end. And the thing sits, it's ready, it's off, abstract, keywords, all that.
Abstract keywords, send it off.
Yes.
And we sort of did that week after week.
You did.
After week after week. Here's sleep, here's our understanding of death, here's the feminisation one was just, because I said to Andrew, and I think this was useful too, what's your favourite of all those chapters? What do you think is the easiest to put into a journal article? And it was clearly feminisation, women and policing, and in out, shake it all about 2 days later that was to a journal, and we just kept doing the easiest, and of course they were all pretty easy because they were thematic.
Yes.
But did that help the time pass through examination too?
Yes, it did. I must say that I think my professional training jumped in again then, because over the years, in terms of relationship with clients and management of the big organisations that I was involved in, I learnt not to worry about things I couldn't control. So I basically didn't. There was a level of apprehension because I possibly in the early stages would have preferred to have been examined by kind of kin, social workers and those sort of people. But my very rough understanding was that the examiners might well be criminologists.
Two of the most famous, internationally respected criminologists on this planet, yes.
Yes, and so I had some misgivings about about how sympathetic they would feel to this social worker who obviously liked working with coppers. I did make it clear in some part of the thesis that I knew from day one that I would never become one because of my inability to be quiet when I was concerned about things, and probably that would have led to a disagreement with a senior officer quite early in my career.
Which I think the criminologists respected a great deal.
Yes, I think they did, but no, I wasn't concerned about that. I knew it was going to happen, and when it finally did, that was the moment of profound relief, and that was surprising, as you may recall.
I certainly do. I'm not getting teary now because I told him in my office, the exam results had come and had been signed off by my boss, the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research. My poor students have to be signed off by Rob, obviously. And we just got the notification that he had just before his meeting. So I hurtled down the stairs and you and I sat across each other on my desk and I said, "You've got it, you're through." And you got emotional.
I did.
I got emotional because it meant so much. But again, you were examined by the best in the world. This wasn't dial-a-mate.
No.
This was the best scholars in the world who gave you a good go. They gave you a good go and they respected this research. So that was remarkable. So we've got a lot of articles out already. We've got a lot sitting there. We've got a lot that are coming out in the next couple of months. It's remarkable. But therefore, now that you're Dr. Andrew, what are the dissemination plans now? So what are we going to do now between, say, now and Christmas?
Okay. The Police Association of South Australia, PASA, the police union,
yes,
were supportive of this from day one.
Yes.
It is on the record and in the thesis that SAPOL itself, through their research and survey coordinating committee, didn't see the need for the research.
Yes.
And so I'd spoken to PASA before that because I think I had an expectation that might happen.
Yes.
Police Association put out all the dissemination stuff. Fiona Verity's letter inviting people to participate appeared in the Police Journal, which is a glossy professional magazine. I was able to use the Police Association officers to interview, which was fantastic. I reckon at 2 or 3 moments during the research, they made announcements in the magazine about how things were going.
To kick off the next stage.
Yep. So that has all happened, and I know that without them and without the good graces of the ethics committee here at Flinders, who had to make a quick decision when they realised SAPOL wasn't on board, but accepted PASA.
Excellent.
When all that happened, then the final question remains, what will PASA, through its excellent head, think about the recommendations that I make?
Yes.
And the observations that their colleagues have made throughout the thesis. Now,
yes.
I have no idea
No.
what the outcome will be, and in a way, I think I'm not overwhelmingly optimistic or anything else about it. I'm due to sit down with the president of the police union in, I think, 5 or 6 weeks' time.
Yes.
Typically unhurried, and we'll have a discussion then. My preference would be to set up a working group of police, retired operational and come up with their version of what my recommendation might become, to see what happens with them.
Because this is where it gets interesting, isn't it? And these are these two words, impact and engagement. Very easy words to use, very complicated to create that iterative engagement. Because, you know, we've got the dissemination in place, so the articles are out, a book is about to emerge from it.
Yes.
So we've got a book, we've got a series of articles, and then the next article, so we've done the academic dissemination, cool, rock and roll, that's fantastic. What does impact and engagement look like here? And it would be using the articles, which we've chosen open access, open source to do that,
yes,
so that you can send links to people. But then it's much more engagement, isn't it? Here are the recommendations, dealing with the police association. You know, is there consultancy work for you here? And I think there certainly is. You're already working with some journalism and some professional organisations. What else could that, I mean, you got into your professional life is punctuated by social justice and making a difference. Your whole career has been about making a difference, and what a career it has been, of which this is the capstone moment. So what else can we do at Flinders University? What can you and I do as a hood to go beyond that dissemination and get that iterative impact and engagement in place for you and for this research? Making that PhD move, Andrew.
I'm not completely sure, but I know the power of the university. I understand that because one of the suggestions that the SAPOL Research and Survey Coordinating Committee made was that even if they did approve the research, they needed to have editorial control of the final product, and the university couldn't have been clearer about their response to that. And
makes you proud to work here, really.
It does. I am. So I think if the university makes it clear that they're behind this process, which you clearly are, and that is transmitted to the Police Association and maybe indirectly to people in SAPOL itself, even up to and including the Commissioner, that I think will have a profound effect, because police organisations have much closer connections these days to tertiary study than they did.
Policing has transformed.
Yes.
Police work has transformed.
Yes, and basically if you want to be commissioned in a Western police organisation these days, you need to study.
You do.
You need to have a tertiary qualification of some kind. One of my recommendations, for example, is that SAPOL do something about management training, because basically the heart of management in police organisations is command and control, and that isn't effective anymore. It doesn't work in terms of the recruits that are now coming into policing and the people who are already there. And the sergeants, I think, were so keen on what I was doing because they're caught in the middle. Yeah. They're caught between this new generation of coppers who come to police academies older and qualified in ways that previously wasn't the case, and in different genders. I think our daughter's graduation course in 2001 was just over 50% women.
There it is.
And the average age was a tad, I think, over 30. So,
and that's transformative of policing.
Yeah. And when I used to go down to the academy in the 70s to talk about domestic violence with the recruits, you'd walk into the room, they'd all be young blokes.
22-year-old blokes.
Over 6 foot tall. Yeah. With a couple of cowering women who wondering about their career choice, sitting in the corner. Now, that's all changed. So I think if we can engage with SAPOL at that level and in that way, if it was a cooperative kind of thing, even if in some ways Flinders became directly involved, just imagine a relationship between Flinders University and the Police Academy. Which
would be remarkable and important in terms of criminology. Criminology is transforming radically around the world at the moment. The classical criminology models have gone. We're really dealing with some ultra-realist criminology at the moment with respect to my colleagues in Northumbria and Teesside. You know, ultra-realist criminology is really where we are going. And Australia has been quite silent in this area, and this is a powerful moment, I think, with your incredible expertise, what you've discovered here, and your recommendations, particularly the importance of sergeants, I think was what, I mean, I got so much out of your research, but considering organisationally the sergeant as the colon, the semicolon or the colon, the point of the sentence that's in balance, and the role of the sergeants in disseminating and managing post-traumatic growth rather than post-traumatic disorder. And also, you know, in the dissemination we're doing, we do have a pretty clear plan. You know, obviously we're doing this vlog, but we're doing a series of videos for you to disseminate on your own purposes and functions, and also podcasts as well, and all sorts of different modalities of writing. So we're putting a lot of material out there that you can use and reuse in different forms. So I think that's important too.
Yep. What I will do as well, I think, is send a personal email to each of the individual police that I interviewed.
Yes.
Giving them a link, clearly, if they're that enthusiastic, and asking them what they think the next step might be. I mean, the reality is that at the centre of the beginning of my research were a group of New South Wales police autobiographies, police officers who had been diagnosed with PTSD and written about their experience, and literally New South Wales police made a whole heap of assumptions without even knowing they were making them. That was the level of support they had. I mean, you could work in crime scene investigation as one of these, did Esther McKay, for 23 years, and no one would suspect for a moment that that was having any impact on your mental health at all until your collapse. Now, we've moved on from that. SAPOL is much, much better than that.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that there need to be some quite basic and usually inexpensive changes that might just transform the way police function, the way they grow into the job, and the expectation they have about their own mental health. Because what your average copper gets almost every day is an indication from somewhere that if they keep on doing the job that they love doing, and all of the coppers that I interviewed were very much engaged in that. I mean, they have a commitment to the job which is more than personal.
Remarkable.
Yeah,
that's right.
So if they keep on getting the message that's going to hurt them, which they get from the media and from some well-meaning, trauma-focused authorities, I think if that's the expectation, then that has to have some impact on how comfortable they are. I'd rather they got the message that policing is a very important role, they know that already, and that it can make you grow into a well-rounded human being both while you're on the job and when you're at home. And what we're talking about, I think, is some quite basic stuff that would assist that. SAPOL doesn't have a fantastic reputation nationally for taking care of its people. If there are book reviews of progress about this stuff, they generally don't get a mention.
No.
And I think this is an opportunity for them to turn that around.
I concur. And South Australia is so distinctive, as we talked about in your thesis, so distinctive in terms of the history of criminality, the history of policing, that it would be wonderful for this distinctive story to continue on in terms of post-traumatic growth. That would be a remarkable narrative, I think, for SAPOL to consider, and you will have my respect and full support if you would like to go in that direction. Last question, returning to you and the thesis, if I can, Andrew, and obviously you've watched all these vlogs, you've been a great supporter of me, a great supporter of Steve, a great supporter of the office since I first met you. Now, there'll be people watching this vlog who are considering entering a PhD, maybe people who have just started and thinking, wow, what the hell have I just got into? So, from that end point, Andrew, and with all this dissemination in front of you, what advice would you offer to those people?
On the social worker, we don't generally give advice, but...
For once, pretend.
Okay. My advice would be expect that you will be challenged in ways that you don't even begin to imagine you'll be challenged. If you think this bears a resemblance to your postgrad work thus far, then you will be surprised. I think the analogy for me is like when you're working with somebody, strangely enough, who is deeply traumatised, you don't begin with them at that point and they have a steady slope towards normalcy and complete control and health.
Yes.
It's always up and down.
It's undulating.
Just when you think you've got it sorted, something will happen, usually. An ex-colleague of mine sent me an email suggesting that I was a clever boy because this had happened. Now, I know that was his theatrical background contributing to that, but it wasn't, I don't think, that I was a clever boy at all. I responded by saying, I think I am grimly determined, and I reckon that's the key. You need to develop resilience, if I may use that somewhat overworked term. And you need to be grimly determined to get to the end, and you need to be supported and supervised in ways that facilitate that at the most difficult moments.
Yeah. And what probably you and I have learned too, and you've been a great, you always learn from students. You should, if you're not learning from students, you need to die. And I've always believed very strongly, Andrew, that every single student has a different supervisor. So I think I'm supervising, 12 students at the moment, and every single one of you get a different supervisor.
Yeah.
And I think that and also I was a different supervisor for you at different points too.
And I think that's your genius, frankly. Anyway.
You bugger.
I don't want to embarrass you.
No, don't you, Dad. But I adore this man. This man is a great citizen of this country, and Flinders University was incredibly lucky that he chose to do a PhD here, firstly, because he's a legend, but secondly, the calibre of the research that has been produced here makes me incredibly proud to be an Australian, and I can't tell you how proud I am that I supervise this. This is a remarkable thesis that will change international policing. And, that's not a bad way to spend your day, Andrew.
No.
So on behalf of this wonderful man, I wish you all love, light and peace. Andrew and T, out.
Out.
Out. Thanks, mate.
Thank you.
How was that?
That was
What's happening?
all right.
That was